Hello, listeners. This talk is in response to someone called Frederick Hohenzollern. I'm not entirely sure if he is actually descended from the Prussian royal family, but nevertheless, he's someone I've spoken to before. He was in one of my hangouts in January, and he lives in Asia. So he made some observations and asked me a question, and here's what he wrote. Based entirely on personal anecdotes, it seems Asian students, particularly in Asia, are not particularly well-rounded or curious. Book reading, interest in politics, or even having hobbies seem to be universally rarer throughout Asia than in the West. Do you find the same to be true, and do you have any thoughts on its cause? All right, well, thank you for those comments and question, Frederick Hohenzollern. To answer the first part of your question as to whether I find the same to be true or not, yes, I would largely agree with your observations. I think they seem to be true here. If I remember correctly, you live in Thailand. People often confuse Thailand and Taiwan, but in this case, I think they're quite similar. Yes, I have seen, known, or taught probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of children in Taiwan. Of course, some do have interests in various things. They have hobbies and so on. But in general, I would say that they don't, or they seem to have far fewer interests than Western children do, and adults also. Adults over here seem to have fewer interests and hobbies and all of that sort of stuff than Westerners do in general. Although I think many of these things are actually changing with a lot of needs. I think things like book reading and so on are probably declining. But nevertheless, I think that you're broadly correct. For instance, if I ask a Taiwanese person what their hobbies are, I can guarantee you that probably 90% of the people I ask will mention at least one of the following things. There are 5 things, and they'll probably mention at least 2 of them. So I'll say, what are your hobbies? And they'll say, eating, that's one. Sleeping, yeah. Shopping, watching TV, or playing video games. And they'll probably tell you at least 2 of those things. I'd say they'll probably mention eating. That'll be one of them. And then one of the other 4. Many will not actually have any real hobbies. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you could say playing video games is a hobby. I wouldn't entirely class it as a hobby, not unless you're some sort of active reviewer of games or something. I don't know. I wouldn't. Likewise, watching TV. Okay, maybe if you watch particular movies and you're some sort of aficionado or something, maybe. Most people don't do it that way. But I remember when I first came to Taiwan, I was really sort of surprised. Every time I would ask someone this question and they'd say eating or sleeping, I'd say, what? But those aren't hobbies. But that's what they do on their weekends. A lot of them, they eat. They go out to eat. And sleep. Yeah, they sleep. And that's a really big thing for them. I wonder to what extent it's a female thing, because I've never been able to sleep more than about 8 or so hours, unless I've been absolutely exhausted or really sick or something. I just naturally wake up after about 8 hours, 8.5 hours. But women, but especially Taiwanese women, man, they could sleep for 16 hours in a row. I don't know how they do it. They love sleeping. Sloth is a big thing over here. When they get the opportunity for sloth, they really embrace it. Now, as to the causes for this, well, firstly, it's difficult to disentangle genetics from culture. I mean, is it a thing that's genetic about Asians, that they don't have hobbies? Or is it a cultural thing? I don't know. It's a bit of a chicken and the egg argument in some ways. These things tend to lead back into one another. They create feedback loops. But I think it begins certainly from the cultural side of it, because I think it's probably both. Certainly from the cultural side of it, it begins quite young. Kids seem to be actively discouraged by adults from being interesting, from doing unusual things, by just sort of not being very passive. The education system in many Asian nations, and this is particularly true in Taiwan, is really grinding. I mean, they have a huge workload of testing and homework and so on. Even to some extent in primary school, elementary school. But it certainly ramps up towards the end of their, sort of grade 6, even grade 5. They test frequently, even at lower levels, but it really ramps up in grade 5 and grade 6 here. And junior high school is another step up again, where they turn the dial another few notches. So the education system is grinding, and a lot of it involves rote memorization of material and so on. And so in that system, there's no room for kids to be unusual. There's no room for kids to do something different, to think very much, because there's an enormous amount of material they cover, and the teacher just drones on out the front of the class. That's pretty much how things are done here. And so, if everything's very exam focused with very black and white answers, you're either correct or you're incorrect, that doesn't really encourage people to be very interesting. Plus, of course, you add in the time factor. They just don't have the time because of the sheer workload. I think I've mentioned in a talk before, I had students once who only got about 5 or 6 hours of sleep, and they were in year 8, they're in the 8th grade. Or was it the 7th? Maybe it was the 7th. No, I think it was the 8th. And you could see them wilting like flowers in the midday sun by the time they were halfway through junior high school. The Year 7 kids were really perky, they had lots of energy and they'd come and talk to you and stuff. Year 8 kids, as soon as they had a spare moment, they just wanted to put their heads on their desk and try to... Here people have this uncanny ability to take micro naps. They could be standing on one foot in a furnace, holding a sharp knife on the palm of their hand or something, and they could still somehow sleep for 2 minutes. So, they just have this grueling workload, and often they do after-school activities, basically cram schools, where they do more and they have a huge amount of stuff they need to do for homework and memorizing for tests. So they don't have time. They really don't have time. And by the time they get to the weekend, they're just exhausted. They're absolutely exhausted, these kids. So, it begins early with these kids. Certainly by the time they hit 11, 12, 13 years old, they're right in the midst of it. And then even beyond that, when they eventually get out of formal education and go and get a job, often their work life is pretty grinding. It's not necessarily difficult, the work they do, and they're often quite inefficient. They spend a lot of time screwing around on the internet, or having a chat with their colleagues. But they're expected to put in what I call face time. They need to just be there. They need to be seen. In many cases, they won't leave until the boss leaves. So, if the boss is there till 8 o'clock, they're there till 8 o'clock. If the boss is in there at 6:30, they're in there at 6:30. That sort of thing. So, they'll put in a lot of time, well over 40 hours per week. And again, when you get home at the end of all of that, and you have to tack on some time at the beginning and end for commuting, you don't necessarily have the energy to want to commit to some sort of hobby. Also, a lot of this here, at least, it's a leave-over from the 6-day working week. A lot of people still work 6 days a week. That's just the nature of their jobs. But there used to be an official 6-day working week couple of decades ago. And supposedly when they were debating about whether to go to a 5-day working week, there were a lot of people who were actually really opposed to it. I mean, obviously, bosses were probably opposed to it because they got more productivity from their workers that way. But people actually discussed the sort of social implications. They were concerned that if people had all this idle time on their hands, that there'd be social unrest. Because there was an issue back then. They were concerned because there was martial law. There were concerns that if they went to a 6-day working week, to a 5-day working week, that there'd be anarchy. People would be plotting crimes on street corners and so on. Actually, what happened was there was a massive domestic tourism and also domestic sort of retail industry that grew up as a result of this, because people had time and money to spend then. But it's partly a leave-over of that also, and also it's about related to that. It's about order and control, and this is especially true with children. Parents don't like their kids just having tons of unsupervised free time, so even after school, they'll send them to these things called Anshin buns and Bushi buns here, basically just after school things, whether they either do their homework in the former case or they learn something extra in the latter case. And they'll spend hours at these things after school because the parents are working till 7, 8, 9 at night. So someone has to keep an eye on the kids, and in some ways this is a good thing because the kids don't have as much of an opportunity to get up to mischief as they do in the West. But it's about social control, and actually they do this kind of stuff at school as well. At every school I've ever worked at in Taiwan, and I've seen this driving past other schools also, they have multiple times during the day when the kids clean the school. And you'll see kids washing the same window that they washed earlier that day, which they also washed the day before, because they get assigned to a particular area and a particular task usually by their homeroom teachers. So you'll see the same kid washing the same window that he washed earlier that day, that he washed yesterday, that he washed the day before that, and so on, that he's been washing, for 3 months, the same window. It doesn't get dirty that frequently, but it's just about social control. You see the same 2 kids sweeping the same area around the same tree, and since the morning 2 more leaves have fallen off that tree. They sweep the 2 leaves and then they just push the dirt around. But it's about social control. And then a lot of these kids, they just go on litter anyway once they're out of school. But it's just about social control. And so a kid in the West, if you went to a school in Australia and said to kids, right, you're going to start washing the same window twice a day, 3 times a day, every day, they'd say, why? What's the point of doing that? And they'd start balking at that. Or if you said, you're going to sweep that same patch of bare dirt that may or may not occasionally have 1 leaf on it, they'd say, why? Right? But it's about social control. That's what it is. And if you get kids to do that from a young age, then they won't question it. I think I've heard this story about how they train elephants. They break the elephant's wheel from a young age, such that even when it's older, they can actually just tie it to a flimsy peg sticking out of the ground. The elephant could pull it out of the ground and run away. They never do, because from a young age they've been conditioned, right? Same thing with all of this. It's just from a young age they've been conditioned against doing anything different, thinking differently, and so on and so forth. So they're not going to be particularly curious or engaged with the world if that's the case. And as I mentioned, they don't have the time and energy in a lot of cases. Younger kids do have hobbies and so on. They'll do things. They'll read books and so on. Younger kids, maybe not quite to the same extent as in the West, but they still do. But then there's that crunch time that comes around the the end of primary school, and then all that goes out the window. Also, adults find it much easier to just give their kids basically electronic babysitters, or to send them to some sort of highly ordered activity, cram schools and so on. Frequently, adults don't have the time to spend with their own kids, because if the adults are working till 7, 8, 9, whatever at night, and if they're working on Saturdays, how can they go and interact with their kids? Whether it's driving them around, right, to take them to activities, because all of that takes time, right? You have to actually be physically present to pick your kid up from that activity or drive him to that activity. So, it's much easier to just put them in front of an electronic device, or send them to some highly ordered and structured activity where everything has already been decided for them, and they just go through the motions and follow the authority figure. Because that means that the adults can then absolve themselves of those responsibilities, and then they can go and work till 9 o'clock at night, or work on Saturdays. And I see this, shockingly, I see this with people who don't even have that excuse. My sister-in-law, whenever we go out to eat, she has a son who's now 2.5, I think, and she's been doing this since he was at least 1.5, maybe younger. We go out to eat, and as soon as he finishes eating, she just sticks an electronic device in front of him, and he watches cartoons. I think it's atrocious. That kid's going to have an attention span about that long, just terrible. But that sort of, it requires no effort on her part. She doesn't even have the excuse of being super busy, because she and her husband live with his parents, and she lives around the corner from her own parents, so she has all 4 grandparents around to help her, and she doesn't have a job, so she's just she has been consumed by modernity. I just made the other talk. I don't know whether I'll upload it before or after this one. The one about taking responsibility for ourselves on the alt-right, where I was talking about sugar and shiny things. She is that to a T, sugar and shiny things. Rather than actually, maybe interact with her kid and talk to her kid, educate her kid, sugar and shiny things, both for him and for her. It's terrible. Also, another issue here in Asia is population density. It's hard for kids to just go out and play, and ride their bikes around and explore and do all of that sort of stuff. When I was a kid, I lived in the suburbs, and the suburbs were not nearly as built up as they are now. There wasn't as much traffic and so on, and then we had certain rules. We weren't allowed to cross major roads, all that kind of stuff. But basically, we'd get on our bikes and just go off and do whatever, get up to all sorts of mischief. Because we didn't have to worry about being run over by a truck in our street. Whereas here, there's tons of traffic everywhere all the time, unless you're deep in the mountains. I mean, I supposedly live in the countryside in a small town, but even when I lived kind of outside the town, there's always traffic here, much more so than in the West. So there's this population density, and if you go to parks or things like that, they're just crawling with people. If you go to any sort of interesting place, they're crawling with people. So kids don't necessarily have the opportunity to just go out and just explore, just play outside. It's too dangerous. It's too crowded. There's too much traffic, and the facilities there are too many people trying to use the same facilities and so on. So there's that as well, I think. That feeds into everything else. Also, Asians, I've found, are very group-oriented and hierarchical. So their activities and their free time, these things are often arranged for them, whether they're at school, at university, at work. They're arranged for them by others. There might be someone who even has that dedicated task at work, either officially or unofficially, but there'll be someone who has that dedicated task of organising social activities for people from that company, You'll see people from a company will travel overseas together, not necessarily even on an official work-related journey for business or anything like that, or paid for by the company. But people will actually travel around with their colleagues. They'll take a sort of they'll go as a big group with people from their work, and this is certainly true with how activities are organised and so on with schools and universities also. So university students, for instance, they're actually often expected they're told by their professors they have to attend certain non-academic activities, social events, various clubs. They have to put on performances. They have to do like dance performances and I don't know, singing or stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of weird, right? You think that's the kind of stuff that you corral a bunch of 8-year-olds into doing, but they do it with 18-year-olds here. And even sometimes they have to clean the university campus. They have to go out and sweep and all that sort of stuff. The kind of stuff they do at high school and junior high school and primary school, some of them still do that at university. It's weird. I mean, I can't imagine when I was at university if one of the faculty members or something had said, right, okay, all of you guys, tomorrow you have to gather at 10 o'clock and you all have to sweep the courtyard. We would have all said, get real, we're not doing that. But that's the thing here. People have a lot of their free time scheduled, organised by other people, whether they're someone within their company or someone in their educational institution. Even informally, people like to do things in groups. They don't like to be by themselves. In fact, often they feel profoundly unsettled, if not scared, and they have all these superstitions about ghosts and all this sort of stuff. People don't like being alone here. They really dislike it, the majority of them. They do everything in groups. And their networks of people are much stronger and longer lasting. So lots of people here stay in contact with and still spend lots of time with classmates, even from as far back as primary school, but certainly junior high school and senior high school, and university, of course. My wife is still regularly in contact with her classmates from university, from high school, both senior high school and junior high school. Her father's, I think, is around 60, something like that. He still meets up with his classmates from school, from primary school and junior high school. He still meets up with them on a semi-regular basis. That's by no means exceptional. That's extremely common over here. People still meet up with people they had as colleagues years and years and years ago, people they did military service with, all sorts of stuff like that. And the activities will be organised by someone, so they won't just sort of meet up for some drinks or something, or just go out and have a chat somewhere. It's highly organised. Someone organises a restaurant, or they're actually going to go on a particular tour, all that sort of stuff. So it's all really organised for them. A lot of people here, older people, will be involved in temples or some other local association, community association or something, and there'll be someone there who'll just organise all of the activities for them. So it's very easy for a lot of people here to literally just skate by, to just cruise along with someone else making all these decisions for them, and they don't do anything else. They just go home and they do those 5 things I mentioned before. They eat, they sleep, they shop, they watch TV, or they play video games, depending on how old they are and whether they're male or female. And even when they go out on tours, and they do those things. So they'll drive for X number of hours, and they'll sort of spend 10 minutes at a tourist site, and then it's like, right, where do we eat? or where are the souvenirs? That's what they do. They do that when they go abroad. I used to teach some adults. I put together a group of adults. These were all women who were upper middle class. They had a lot of money, and many of them had been overseas. And I said to them, oh, where have you been? And one woman said, oh, Sweden. And I said, oh, yeah. What was that like? And she couldn't tell me anything about Sweden, only about the food she had there. And of course, they all go to Chinese restaurants. And just some souvenirs she bought. And she bought, when I say souvenirs, they weren't even souvenirs. She bought brand name clothes or handbags or whatever, Louis Vuitton or that sort of stuff, Gucci, that she could have bought in Taiwan, So she went over to Sweden to buy a handbag she could have bought in Taiwan. She went over to Sweden to have Chinese food. That's what they do. And you say, oh, so, what's in Sweden? What's in France? What's in Italy? I don't know. Like, we just did some stuff, but I had some good Chinese food, bought a Louis Vuitton handbag. That's what they do. Because since they were 3 years old, someone's been scheduling their stuff for them, and they just go along with it, So, they're really group oriented. And continuing on from that, a lot of Asians seem to be extremely materialistic. They go to work, they make money, they spend money. That's what they do. They're really big on conspicuous consumption, even with their experiences. And I know there are lots of people in the West like that also, but they're really into that here. If you can't take a photo of it and put it on Facebook, then it didn't happen. Then it wasn't worth doing, basically. If someone can't like you on Facebook, then it's not worth spending your time or money on that thing, essentially. Even when you do see people reading, like on public transport, I'll see people reading. Invariably, it's one of two things that they're reading. Either it's English, and when they study English, most of the time, especially when they're older, and by older I mean teenagers or older, adults, it's basically so they can pass an officially recognized test, which will then allow them to either get some sort of pay increase or something within their existing job, or it will allow them to do some further study, usually abroad, so they can go and study in America or something, which eventually will allow them to have a better job, right? So it's really directed in that regard. Or if it's not English, it's a similar kind of thing. It'll be they'll be reading a technical manual or something like that. It'll be something job related. You'll see a guy reading something to do with engineering or something. And so it's really highly focused upon their jobs or their future jobs. You rarely see people on public transport reading novels. They don't do that. They either study English or they study some sort of technical manual. But you almost never see people read novels. And actually, around where we are, I have discovered this, and my wife has discovered this with the local libraries, 2 local libraries here, going to the library and borrowing a book, and you can see where they've stamped the slip, you can see the dates on there, and in many cases, having been the first person who's ever borrowed that book, like I've borrowed some kids' books, and I've been the first person to borrow those books. And someone suggested to me that this is because when they fill up one of those slips, they can remove the slip and put a new one in. They have a sort of a semi-adhesive surface, so they're just enough to stick, but you can actually remove them without tearing a page. But in many cases, I have been the second person to borrow the book, and I've looked at the previous stamp, and it was 5 years ago. And my wife has experienced this many times also. Or where I've read some books from a series of books, and I've seen, I don't know, maybe someone only read one of those books, but looking across the series of books, there have been some where I've been the first stamp in the book on the slip, and then there have been some other books in that series that have 1 or 2 other stamps. There was one I borrowed, I don't know, a month or 2 ago, where over the past decade, there had only been 4 other people who had borrowed that book. So people just, they don't read for pleasure here. It's highly focused upon their career. If they read because they don't have time, right, or they don't have the energy. Now, things are changing to some extent. Younger people in particular are sort of dropping out of the rat race. Some of them, not all of them, only a tiny minority still. So some people are dropping out of the rat race, but that's pretty hard to do actually in Taiwan at least, unless they come from money, because there's no social safety net here. There's no welfare state. So basically, you work or you die essentially, or you mooch off someone in your family. There's no welfare here as such. So they can't, right? And there are often a lot of family expectations. Obviously, a lot of parents put huge expectations on their children in terms of educational and career outcomes, and also it's pretty common here too for children, and by children I mean adult children, working children, to give their parents money. So once kids start working, even if they don't live with their parents, they'll give them a certain percentage of their paycheck each month. It's a fairly significant portion in many cases. At least 20%. So, it's changing a little bit, but people are still pretty much locked into the way they do things here. And also people tend to look on dropouts with a certain weird mix of admiration, jealousy, and awe, and perhaps disdain also, depending on what kind of dropout they are. But so it's not really socially acceptable for people to drop out of all of this work culture and going out with your friends to eat every weekend and that whole sort of thing that I've described already. That said, there are more people who are traveling and trying new things, all sorts of new things, tentatively. One thing two things actually that I've noticed in the time that I've been in Taiwan. Firstly, a lot of people now are trying surfing. I don't know if that's a huge thing now, but a few years ago it used to be a really big thing. A lot of people, they'd go to the beach and just sort of splash around on a surfboard. They weren't really surfing that much, but they tried it. But the other thing that's really big that you still see a lot is families doing cycling tours together. I remember when I first came to Taiwan, around where I lived in a big city, there was only one cycling shop, and now in that neighborhood there are multiple cycling shops, often selling quite expensive bikes, but cheaper bikes too. And actually, certainly Giant, that bicycle brand is from Taiwan. But people do cycling tours now. It's a huge thing, particularly in certain parts of the country. You'll see whole families or groups of people, like maybe they're work colleagues or something, extended families, who knows. But you'll see big groups of people doing bicycling tours. I mean, to some extent, it still falls into the same category of you do it with a set group of people. I'm sure they all, they go to particular places to eat and they buy certain things and so on. It's still very much on the old model, but it's still a little bit different. The two groups of people or two types of people I've noticed in Taiwan at least, who do seem to have hobbies and other interests, are either particular types of self-employed or entrepreneurial people. Then they always have a certain sort of way of going about life. I mean, that's why they're entrepreneurs to some extent, or self-employed, because they do think of things a little bit differently, and they have a certain kind of curiosity and drive and energy and so on. So those kinds of people, and they tend to have certain characteristics as well. They're from the cities. They're fairly cosmopolitan. They're usually relatively young. Like they're usually in their 30s. These guys. Maybe they worked for someone else for a few years and then they started their own thing, and they're just starting to enjoy the fruits of their labours in their 30s. Usually in their 30s, more guys than women, but they're very dynamic, they're very outgoing, all this sort of stuff. Those types of people, or the other group, and it's by no means all of this group, because overall, most people in this group are actually doing pretty badly, and they've sort of really consumed by modernity, are Taiwanese Aborigines. Some of the Aborigines here are actually pretty interesting. Frequently they speak English really well. They're often multilingual because they don't speak Chinese at home. And Aborigines in Taiwan are known for being very good at music and art. They seem to be very tactile, and they're not book learners. And their culture doesn't seem to encourage that in the same way that Han Chinese culture does. And so obviously that means that for those who are not famous singers or things like that, they tend to do worse because they're not book learners, and this is a society of book learners, and that's where the power and money is. But those kinds of people often have various interests, that, crafts and hobbies and so on. And some of them are pretty interesting. Many are not, but some of them are. I mean, I think these two groups of people, these kinds of entrepreneurs, they have become successful by being different, and so that creates a feedback loop to some extent. I mean, and they're always on the lookout for new opportunities and new things, and so they're naturally engaged and curious. And the second group, they start from being in a position of being somewhat on the periphery and outside mainstream society to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent. And so, both their culture and their position within the broader culture means that they're more willing to do these things, or there's not as much of a stigma for them to do different things and be different. I mean, you can meet some pretty interesting people over here occasionally, but overall, I think that I would agree with Frederick Hohenzollern that people here tend to be less into hobbies and general interests and so on than in the West. I mean, there's a massive amount of inertia in Taiwan, and Taiwan as a country and the Taiwanese as a people are actually going through a process currently where they're really beginning to examine this and assess this, because they made a lot of money up until the late 90s, basically by being worker drones. They developed really quickly, and they should be given credit for that. But they did that by working themselves to death, and basically by being fairly uninteresting. And then they hit what's called the middle income trap, both economically but also in parallel to that culturally in many ways. They hit that in the first decade of this century or this millennium. And they're having to think about that now, about quality of life, and about the fact that they can no longer just compete with places like China or Vietnam because of lower labor costs in those places. And so it's not enough to just be a drone anymore. Maybe if they're going to truly make the leap into being fully developed or retaining the gains that they've already made, they need to start being a little bit more quirky and doing other things. So there is somewhat of a national dialogue about this at the moment. It's not as pronounced as in other places, but people are aware of it, and they are changing here. And I guess to finally answer that sort of question about whether it's cultural or genetic, think about this from a genetic point of view. I do know some people who are the children of Asian immigrants who were born in the West, or at least raised in the West. Now, immigrants are a particular group, and maybe they have their own set of genetics. But nevertheless, these guys have grown up to be pretty interesting, actually. So, when in the broader environment that has the right conditions, in the West, for instance, many of them, perhaps fewer still than Westerners themselves, though there may still be cultural baggage from their parents, but many of them have turned out to be interesting. So it seems to me that there's nothing that means that Asian people must be ant people. Maybe they're slightly more inclined to that. They don't have to be ant people. But it's just inertia, I guess. So anyway, that's the end of the talk. I hope it has been informative. I hope that has answered your inquiry, Frederick Hohenzollern. And I hope it's been interesting to other people. And as always, please comment beneath this talk if you would like to. And thank you for listening.